I want you to think about that. Because what we're talking about is doing something that you and I cannot do of ourselves. And it's something that we do not do instinctively. I was talking with my daughter, and we were discussing about the little babies. And we were noticing how it's so instinctively easy for them to do things that they shouldn't do. It's just instinctual. You have to teach them to share. We don't come here with a sharing heart. We come here with a selfish heart. So our 2 grandchildren had to be convinced a few times yesterday to share. Instead, one would say, mine. The other would say, mine. Now, we didn't teach them mine. The first thing they know how to tell you is mine. You know why? Because instinctually, self-preservation and taking an interest in oneself is the top of the list. Now, to put others first has to be taught. Now, why am I telling you that? Because walking in light has to be taught. Instinctually, naturally, without any help whatsoever, we walk in the dark. And the writer here realizes I'm about to tell these people some things that they're not going to want to hear. But I need them to understand that you got to realize that I didn't get this from myself. I didn't create this teaching or this doctrine, but it came straight from the same one that was passed down to us. And he's telling us to pass it down to you. And now these writers are telling us to continue to keep passing it on down. Because someone still has to remind the people of God today there is a way to walk that pleases God, and there's a way to walk that doesn't please God. And I'm again have to say some pretty tough things. One of the first things I need to say is, just because a person says they're walking with God doesn't mean that they are. Just because you say you are doesn't mean that you are. It's not what I say that determines if I'm walking in the light. It's what I do and how I do it. That makes the difference. So as he moves on into verse 5, he says, "This is the message which we have heard from him." He defines who him is. He tells you it comes straight from the mouth of Jesus, who spoke only what the Father told him to say. And and keep in mind that in verse 4 he tells you, and we're writing these things not because we want you to be upset, not because we want you to be disappointed, not because we want you to say it's too hard to walk in the light, but I want you to have a life that's full of joy. Now, the Bible tells us that the joy of the Lord is our strength. So obviously the writer here figures that if I teach you these things that Jesus taught us, it'll give your life a state of joy and fullness of joy that you otherwise will not have. And let me just be right honest with you. You seem to think, and so do I from time to time, that my light is much more accommodating and more rewarding and more fulfilling. But have you ever noticed when you operate in your own human understanding of things outside of God, the repercussions are so much greater? The outcome usually has a lot of oppositions that wouldn't have come. I mean, you're going to get opposition anyway, but when you do it outside of God's will, you get some real raw opposition. And it's usually things that come back to bite you. And then you're saying, I should have never said that. I should have never done that. I should have never been there. Because when you operate in your own mind and in your own enlightenment, you're bound to pay for it dearly. But when you walk in the light, It's a different outcome. He says, listen, this is the message which we heard from him, and what are we going to do? We're going to declare it to you. Now, here's the first thing that everybody needs to come to accept, that God is light. Now, that excludes us, doesn't it? Up front, that means very clearly, you and I are not light. Because the Bible says, who is light? God is light. And he didn't put anybody in there with him. He didn't say God and. He just says God is. God defines himself in the truest form of his nature as being light. And when he says that he's light, what he's saying is that the translucency of God is so transparent and clear that there's nothing foul, nothing unclean, nothing unholy, nothing impure, nothing of any level of negativity whatsoever dwells in God. And I'm going to be quite frank with you. I know we believe that to an extent, and we talk about that, but we don't really start to spend enough time and really meditate on what that means. God is light. That means anything that we need to know, God knows. Anything that we need to get an understanding of, he understands it. And let me just add this to it too. If you don't know, and if you don't understand, you can rest on the reality that he knows and that he understands, whether he chooses to make you know it or understand it or not. And that's a mouthful for us. When you talk about walking in the light, what you're really saying is that am I willing to walk in the full presence of God? And since God is light, and you got to understand something, right up front, keep it in your mind. Because of his light being pure, uncontaminated, nothing of any level whatsoever is evil in him. You cannot attribute any evil in this world to God. None. Evil does not come from God. People still don't believe that. People question that. But evil can't come from God because God is light. And in him there is no darkness. How much? At all. At all. So in other words, you can't have two opposites coming out from the same source. Out of God flows nothing but goodness, pureness, wholesomeness. Everything that's pure and right and more, even morality is at its peak in God. All right? And the world doesn't want to receive that because the world wants to even recreate realities of morality. And we're living in a day and time that if you're not careful, brothers and sisters, our children are not going to believe in our sense of morality because they're going to be educated from little children to see and believe life to be according to the concepts of the darkness of this world. And I'm telling you, parents, you got a job on your hands. And it didn't start in 2010. This job was on your hands the moment that baby was born. Your job is to convince your children to know that what God says supersedes what the world says. God is light. But in human beings, there's darkness. He goes on, he says, listen, if we say that we have fellowship with him, and this is hard for us, if, that little teeny word, if